My name is Juha Teperi. I'm Dean at the Faculty of Social Sciences in this university, and it is my great pleasure to act as chair for this last plenary session of the day. As our rector told you earlier today, the reason to found our university in 1925 was really to give young people of humble origins a route to realize their potential as thriving citizens of our society. Now, almost 100 years later, and as a most popular, most comprehensive university, we are still proud of those roots which were based on social values. So as a Faculty of Social Sciences, it is our obligation really to make sure that also in the future we are part of the academic global community which is looking for new solutions to promote fair and equitable societies. So we are not only most proud of being host of this conference, actually we feel activities like BIEN2018 Congress are in the core of our raison d'être, our reason to exist. So please feel most welcomed. Now it's my most pleasant duty to introduce the last plenary speaker of the day, Dr. Louise Haagh. Louise Haagh obtained her doctorate at Oxford University in late 90s in politics. She held then British Academy Research Fellowship at St. Anthony's College at Oxford until 2001. In that year, she then took a lectureship at York University, where she now is reader. She's been a visiting fellow in a number of universities like Cornell, Yonsei, and Brazil Center at Oxford University. Louise Haagh is elected co-chair and acting chair of the Basic Income Earth Network. She's also co-editor-in-chief of the academic journal Basic Income Studies. Among general topics, themes of Louise's research are democratization of human development, economic justice, modalities of institutional change, and social transformation. Examples of her empirical work include international comparative analysis on labor market institutions, welfare systems, and developmental transformations in countries like Chile, South Korea, Brazil, Nordic states, UK. The societal impact of Louise's work is not only mediated through her prolific output of books and scientific papers, she also has acted as an expert for a range of international organizations and public bodies, including Council of Europe, Danish Parliament, House of Commons in the UK. And her work has been referred to in major media in a number of countries. Well, today, Louise is going to give a talk titled The Ethics and Economics of Basic Income Revisited, Devil's Deals and Some Ways to Avoid Them. She also has promised to leave, or at least to do her best, to leave some space for discussion at the end of her session. So now, dear friends, it's time to welcome Dr. Louise Haagh.
Okay, I'm honored to be here, and thank you for that very generous, over-generous introduction, which I now have to live up to. So today I'm going to talk about how global changes have challenged the basic income debate, with particular reference to the Nordic welfare state. And by global changes, I mean the apparent moment of opportunity for basic income since 2016, on the one hand, and the developments linked with the global economic crisis, on the other hand. And I'm going to argue that we should think not only about how the universal welfare state needs basic income, but how basic income needs the universal welfare state and the institutions that are linked with it. And I'm going to suggest that greater visibility of basic income has generated a certain amount of illusion. Beneath the veneer of a unified global debate, have conditions for basic income in fact become more diverse and more difficult? So to illustrate, two interesting predictions I've come across about basic income in recent years include by Eric Olin Wright, when he said that basic income may be an agent in the reform of capitalism and the welfare state, and even a transcendence beyond the two, on the one hand. And Niels Meyer, the Danish physicist who introduced basic income, or one of the persons who introduced the concept of basic income in the 1970s in Denmark, who said that in 2016, who said then that basic income, he thought, will be simply a cheap parking space for the poor. It's two very different predictions. And I think those predictions can both be true, depending on the context. So it seems we can legitimately ask the question, has basic income peaked too soon, or perhaps at the wrong time? Sorry, how do I do this down? Oh, there we go. I'll try and stick to my PowerPoint henceforth. Because the juncture we're at is also one of rising inequality, populism, economic instability, and of course, global public austerity. So I'm going to make the proposition that whilst we seemingly are closer politically to a basic income, we've never been farther from realizing a real basic income or the objectives and goals standardly linked with a basic income, such as for individuals to attain greater stability and control over their lives. And the reason for that is that these outcomes are actually governed by a deeper condition, which is the attainment of substantive equality in society. And this, I think, generates an equality paradox, which is that basic income cannot itself generate the conditions that would make it effective for freedom. And as an extension of that, you might say, we're living through an opportunity paradox. As basic income is getting greater visibility, it's doing so in the context of major crises. And such moments generate political risks. Some genuine gains, of course, may exist, but they also involve devil's deals that ultimately may lead to a politics of diminishing returns as experiments fade out. Indeed, we've seen some of that, or they get stuck at a partial stage. So in the rest of my talk today, I'm first going to talk a little bit about how an institutional perspective allows us to take a step back and look more critically at what are good and bad conditions for basic income. And if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about the challenges that this represents for the Nordic welfare states in particular. Okay, so an institutional perspective suggests that a pure predistributive ideal, whereby giving everyone the same basic property generates frictionless interaction, a kind of linear form of equality, just is not realistic, because informal institutions and hierarchies form in that kind of context. And so this means that as inequality and informality have intensified in the last 20 years, other general assumptions in basic income narrative, if I may call it that, are also at risk. For example, the idea that with a basic income, social relations and bargaining can become based to a greater extent in morality and equality. I'm not sure the conditions exist that we might say that with great confidence. So a counterclaim is that a basic income that's stable and effective for a range of freedoms is more likely to emerge as an outcome of other democratizations, rather than, as we sometimes assume, basic income first, democratization later. In particular, we know that formalization of the economy drives human development, investment, and empowerment. And as the economist Ugo Colombino, who's done some great mathematics on the feasibility of financing basic income, he has shown that good fiscal conditions for basic income correlate with a high level of female participation in the economy and also with a high level, per implication, of shared care in society. So formalization can, in this sense, be seen to be a precondition of basic income. Now, as a very simple representation of formality, the graph here shows the relationship between the inclusiveness of tax systems. I think I'm referencing an article where you can see the appendix for all these figures. The inclusiveness of tax systems and the level of spending in GDP on the one hand, inclusiveness of tax system on the one hand, and the level of spending in GDP on the other hand, on education, training, and childcare, so the classic human development services. And this is around 2007, so pre-austerity, okay? So if we now move to post-austerity, 2016, you can see that the level of formalization is reduced. Countries are moving back across the horizontal spectrum, but countries are trying to maintain the level of human development investment. So basically what you're seeing here is a heavily constrained policy scenario. The public sphere is getting smaller, choices are getting more constrained. And that's the background for the devil's deals that I mentioned at the beginning. Essentially, where inequality and informality are growing, we can't assume that a basic income translates into basic income as a property right, in either of two meanings, as a permanent legal institution or as a social state enjoyed by individuals. A social state of enjoying control is usually a composite of a number of rights, and so basic income cannot stand alone. And a good example of the difference, just to conceptualize what I'm talking about, is owning your house on a piece of paper, so legally, but not as a state, where you cannot keep up with mortgage payments, or if you own your house outright, but the neighborhood is full of thieves, you're not enjoying the substantive value of your legal ownership, or at least somehow diluted. And the same with income security. Okay, so you have legal rights to income support, could be a basic income, but to experience, or partial basic income, but to experience a social state of actually owning this security, psychologically, you need all, or at least most of the features of basic income, but you also need a society in which having this income translates into valuable forms of control over your life. So to represent the problem in an ideal way, you have these two triangles. So the first is the global economy that we're moving towards at faster or slower speed, depending on the context. This is the global competition economy. And my contention is that in this kind of economy, weak distributive versions of basic income, so distributive versions where maybe time delimited and not legally based, are more likely. Now, essentially, in market democracies, my contention and that of other fellow sociologists is that social organization can take two forms, okay? A competitive hierarchical form, which is what we're seeing or moving towards, or a more ordered and stable participatory form, which I suppose I'm arguing would be a more conducive context for basic income. So for now, let's assume that a basic income that's effective for certain key outcomes involves two kinds of complementarities between the elements of basic income: universality, unconditionality, individuality, but also permanence, and a supportive environment. So those two complementarities are important to avoid the devil's deals. Devil's deals involve a decoupling of one or both of these complementarities. So an example of this kind of decoupling is the normalization that I think we are seeing now of the idea of a time-delimited basic income. So you see lots of cases where a 2-year experiment is still called a basic income. Or in the UK, the recent proposals, basic income for a certain age group, justifies against the idea that this would help that age group to seek work, and so on and so forth. And when I hear about these suggestions, I think about cycle lanes in Britain, whereby halfway down the road you're relatively safe because you're on the left-hand side of a paint a line, a 3 inches little space, and then halfway down the line, the path where it gets most dangerous, the line disappears. And in fact, we have good evidence from Latin America of this kind of scenario where cash grants, which of course are not legally based, not permanent, cash grants that end actually leave people worse off. When you talk about the narrowness of the road, you can think about the public sector, and what I'm trying to say is, where the road is too narrow, a basic income becomes vicariously dangerous in the sense that it attains certain illusory properties it can't last. Another devil steal is polemicism, and this is whereby advocates are shuffled into dialogues where we are forced to defend basic income against various things. So in the UK, the most popular thing is universal services. In fact, a number of documents start with, there is this idea of a universal basic income, but instead we have universal services, and this is how the debate is in the UK. In this context, another devil's steal is then incrementalism, the idea where we feel quite safe that as long as we get some part of the basic income, we'll eventually get the whole thing. I'm not sure that we can count on that. And so this leads me to talk about the rescue trap, which is the fact that we have very good reason to accept partial version of basic income when there's rising inequality, rising state coercion in the context of benefit sanctions. But the catch here is that merely lifting conditions, so not going all the way and giving a universal basic income, merely lifting conditions of poverty grants may actually allow conditionalities to come back in. And you might say this is actually what happened in countries like Denmark, for example, where conditions were lifted in the 70s and 80s, but not in a kind of legal way, and then of course they came back in. In a development context, so you hear the argument about India, that the franchise is so hugely significant, one person, one vote, because it's the only real form of equality in the country. So this being the case, the franchise has somehow allowed inequality to continue. Of course, that's also the case in Latin America. Could the same thing happen to basic income? So I thought it was interesting when I read about the Indian pilots, whereby cash grants allowed bonded labor, or varieties of bonded labor, to pay off or evade some of their labor debt in cash, by cash. And obviously this is an immediately liberating and indisputably wonderful thing, but it also suggests how basic income in its own, especially if it's of low value, may become usurped into other unequal structures, all right? So unequal land ownership in the case of India, but not just India. If you look at Europe, given the rate of unsecured indebtedness and the way and the rate in which it is rising after the crisis, could basic income simply become mortgaged to debt? And even if we were to be able to legislate against it, could we police it? Because law is only effective where conditions are not too prevalent. And if you want figures on unsecured debt, I can give you them. But just to give one example, before the crisis in Europe, 10% of all households faced arrears within a year. That's before the crisis. In the UK, unsecured debt rose by 7% since the crisis, and so on and so forth. So this leads me to think of another devil's steal, which is, of course, the neoliberalization of basic income, whereby the danger is that somehow basic income is introduced in a way that it reaffirms inequality, informality, or weak states. The IMF's recent take on basic income, I think, is relevant here. The IMF argues that basic income may be relevant for third world countries or developed emerging economies because the state is weak, right? But in mature welfare states, it's not relevant because we can check people's behavior if you had a good administrative state. And so this takes me then next to the problem of economic populism, which I think is another devil's steal to avoid. And that's because it's always a risk when you stake a reform on a crisis. And I think here it's revealing how in the European Social Survey, you see that the countries in which support for basic income is highest are countries with high levels of inequality, right? In countries with lower levels of inequality, there's a more heavy dose of skepticism. And of course, it should be generally said that support is actually surprisingly high for basic income in Europe, but there are nevertheless these differences. Economic populism also includes what I call wishful economics. The idea that with a basic income we can all share equally in automation, or we can somehow self-organize meaningful work on work collaborations. Now, I think these ideas are context dependent. The idea that you can leave employment and come back to it after you've finished a couple of years caring for your child or having some leisure, that depends on a high level of formalization, a high level of recognition of the difference between carers and others in the labor market. And I don't think informality is going to solve that problem. So the occupational wasteland, as I call it, in that sense, it's not an opportunity for basic income. It's a problem for basic income. And so finally, we need to reconsider, I think, the idea that an active state is necessarily a controlling state, or necessarily paternalism is necessarily a bad thing. And you see many examples, and this is an interesting feature of my research, at least on public bureaucracies, is that social workers are people who can be trapped in bad policies, like benefit sanctions. The idea of a public that cares is something that's still valuable to retain. The idea that I've heard expressed by social workers, certainly that have been involved in implementing lifting of sanctions, is that sanctions don't represent a public that cares. So that's still valuable. The idea of a public bureaucracy, in that sense, doing social work, is still valuable. Now, the charts here show that countries with higher social equality, predictably perhaps, spend more on both training and benefit administration. But in an article which I'm publishing later this year, where I compared benefit sanctions' impact on health in different countries, I found that they were much worse in countries that spend less. Okay? The health impact of benefit sanctions were much worse in countries that spend less. In other words, where the public sector is smaller, because what happened in these cases, people simply fell out of the public framework altogether, all right? And you had high rates of suicides, high rates of deaths within a year of disqualification from benefits. So this leads to the thought that we might think about basic income not as an instrument to replace the classic institutions of the welfare state, but to convert them, because the public norms they represent are still too valuable to lose, and they take a long time to create. Okay? So finally, this takes me to the Nordic welfare state. Because I've argued, these are just different countries, different years. I've argued about the Nordic welfare state that the basic income actually fits very well in the Nordic tradition when you look at it in real terms. Of course, there's problem at the level of discourse, but in real terms, in real institutional terms, it fits very well, given the more developed systems of public finance and also of economic property rights in terms of control of work, control of occupation, and control of time that you can document are higher in Nordic states and some other countries like Holland. And yet, the Nordic state now suffer many of the same devil's deals that we see globally. And you can therefore argue that conditions, and agree with Meyer, the physicist I quoted at the beginning, that conditions for basic income were most optimal in 1970s and 1980s, before workfare, before flexicurity. And here's an interesting thing, because I've heard the argument, certainly in Denmark, expressed that flexicurity is an ideal route to basic income. Right? What is flexicurity? Flexicurity is security in exchange for labor flexibility. Yeah? And I think that's wrong. I worry about this argument, because flexicurity and workfare, benefit conditionality, sanctions, and etc., they were always intimately connected. Why? Because when you have labor flexibilization, informalization, what you get is a more punitive state to control the outcome, to control the beast, to control the exclusions. Okay? Because when states cannot govern with society, through institutions of the society, they govern punitively. So unless we think we're going to get rid of states altogether, we need good states, okay? Good conditions for basic income. So then we come back to the opportunity and equality paradoxes that I talked about at the beginning, because it's very clear to me that the greater skepticism that you see in Nordic states, undoubtedly you see that in European Social Survey, but you also see it just talking to politicians and so on, the greater skepticism is linked with the worry about devil's deals. There was an awareness of devil's deals. For example, the concern that's been voiced in Denmark by the left, here we need this picture, which is about the red rose with blue thorns. Okay, so this is a social democratic rose, but it's a left rose. It's a promise of a better future, coming with blue thorns. In other words, a conservative content. And this is how the left thinks about basic income in Denmark. And I think overcoming this perception is not so straightforward. It's important, but not so straightforward. So the argument has been made, for instance, the basic income is a massive strike fund. You know, so the unions, yeah, take it. It's a massive strike fund. You don't need, you know, it's better foundation for labor activity. And I do think, yes, that is one way to sort of make the connection. But I don't think it goes far enough, because as any person who's been involved in labor organizing knows, strike is a last resort. Yeah? The conflict is a last resort. The real power lies in the institutions. And when a strike is won, it's because everyone knows the institutions are strong and labor is strong institutionally. Okay? So it's not in the conflict that power lies. It's in the institutions. And of course, the labor movement is wise enough and knows not to be fooled by that. So here I think there's a lot of mileage in a discourse that focuses on shared interests, instead of necessarily saying we need to go looking for new constituencies. I think we need to focus on shared interests, and I think we can convince that basic income can help improve other institutions when we take that kind of route. Europe has real development problems. This is interesting. When I talk to politicians in Europe about this, and I say development policy is really important, they said, oh, why? Which country? Do you mean Lesotho, India, Brazil? I said, no, I'm talking about European countries. So Europe has forgotten the idea of development as a problem of the society, which is quite interesting. But Europe has real development problems. Lack of nurses and doctors in the UK. There's a huge shortage of nurses and doctors, but there's no funding to train them. And so, you know, you have these bottlenecks, and basic income obviously is in a very, I think, visible way of helping to improve that kind of development problem. But you have young people who are looking for something to do. They're interested in conservation, environmental advancement, and so on. They haven't got the resources. They don't have the skills. And so basic income and development policy fit together very nicely. So I think there's real opportunity for basic income advocates now, because basic income is actually not very well understood. Okay? So it's all over the media, but I don't think it's really well understood in concrete terms, in terms of the complementarities that really exist and the potential that exists for improving other institutions. And so I think this suggests that it's in the dirty detail. It's exploring the effects of basic income on other institutions. You don't need to go on the big utopias, just focus on the effects on other institutions that we already have, how they can function better, how they've been decaying. And that's where the really transformative effects of a basic income are most likely to be taken seriously in the wider society, beyond the circle of the already converted. So therefore, in my view, if you want a progressive UBI, one that's effective for freedom, then you need to look at supportive conditions for basic income. All right? And to my mind, other people may think differently. They have 4 pillars: a high level of public finance and GDP, absolutely necessary; a sustained commitment to cross-class universal welfare. If you look at welfare states and you compare them, you see that the countries with the lowest level of inequality are the countries in which the middle and upper classes also enjoy some share of public services. You need, third, a rebuilding of what I call property rights and economic stability. This is a social state concept. It's the idea that you're actually, as a social state, enjoying a sense of economic stability. You have a sense of ownership of it. And that's not just in income, but in housing, education, social care, and occupation. I think these fit together, the sense of security and income. One is not a replacement for the other. And this entails a regulatory public. All right? A regulatory public is important. And fourth, an extension of collective ownership, therefore, of economic development and finance to make that possible. So public control of the money system, or at least the largest share of it, both in terms of ownership and regulation. And also collective thinking about development. Where are we going, you know? So in this context, instead of asking, can the old universal welfare state survive without a basic income, we should be asking, can basic income survive without old universal welfare state? Now going back decades, the idea of shared development is necessary for basic income. And I have 2 minutes. Okay, so what I've argued today is that the level of social equality in society is instrumental in affecting the viability as well as the effects of a basic income. Where inequality is generally high, the effect of basic income may appear greater, okay? But in fact it's smaller. This is a paradox. A way out of that paradox is to be concerned with the wider conditions for basic income in the new environment. Focusing on basic income on its own may turn out to be illusory in key respects, and its temptation is, of course, to do that, the greater visibility of basic income. But actually, with global public austerity threatening to break up the integrity of basic income and creating scenarios where the partial or low value basic income is unable to translate into the real forms of control that in the narrative we link with it, we need to look beyond basic income itself. And so to conclude, there are many ways of promoting the case for basic income, but working to secure conditions for basic income, conditions that would make a basic income both possible and effective, may be more important than is commonly understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise, for this thought-provoking contribution to this conference. I'm pretty sure there is a number of people who want to comment on your presentation and make questions. There are microphones in the front, so please, when you get one, first present yourself, and then the floor is yours. There's a gentleman in the front here.
I hear nothing, is it?
Yeah, it's on, you just have to.
All right,
Yeah.
Better now. But it sounds like a pretty tall order to get your supportive conditions. And if you look at the old Chinese ideogram, you know, crisis is opportunity, your idea, well, a crisis is not a good time to make change. I just wonder if you'd comment a little further on that. And also, well, how do we get there from here? All those conditions that you set is an agenda, political agenda for 15 or 20 years, I would guess, in many of the, when we're running against the tide of all the technological and global trends. So could you elaborate?
Well, I think even conservative estimates of how we're going to introduce a basic income do think about 10 years, 15 years. You know, if you're going to implement a basic income, in the current fiscal environment, you're looking at 10 to 15 years. So I think being realistic is not contrary to being utopian in that sense. I think in order to be utopian, you also got to have to be realistic in a sense. My talk is really, it's designed to be provocative. It's designed to say, you know, it's time to talk about wider conditions, and it's important not to be cheated out of a cheap basic income, you know. You know, people have different views, but it's important that they're debated. It's important that a diversity of views are openly debated, including amongst ourselves. And if we want to reach a wider audience in terms of promoting the value of security in society, then I think security in society needs to be explained in broader terms.
Next question or comment is over there, right next to the stairs. Please.
Hi, Louise.
Hi.
Thank you for that sobering talk. My question is, and coming from an American perspective, right, where we have none of these things, if we had all the pillars that you describe, security and occupation, housing, healthcare, you know, et cetera, what is the role of a basic income?
Well, the role of basic income, well, I mean, let me start in a different way, okay? I think that I've argued in a couple of pieces that basic income is a missing piece in the universal welfare state, okay? And I think it could be used for stupid reasons like the word income, all right? So people assume the word income must be earned, yeah? But actually, we get lots of things for free, don't we? That are not earned, including in the United States. I mean, schooling, for one. I mean, you may not get healthcare, but you get schooling, you get roads, you get lots of things, okay, for free. Okay? And yeah, in the Nordic welfare states, to say that's a case where you have all these things that you don't have in the United States. We speaking as Danish person growing up there, and relying on income support for a period of time, you know, when I was 18, we had pretty good conditions for basic income. And that leads me to say, from experience, when you have these other things, when you have a value of security in society, it's more likely that you'll get this conversion. But I think if you look back historically, you need to go back, right back, to the introduction of the means test. And that's where it started, right? That's where the misconception started. Because another thing I've said a few times is I don't think, if you think about it in those terms, you think about the development of the welfare state, this missing piece scenario, then actually basic income is really not that radical. What's radical in universal healthcare, you know? And basic income, especially if it's low, is not really radical, you know, it's just like, and it's absolutely necessary to sustain inclusion. But of course, the reason why we leapt along with the means test is because other things intervened. You had world wars, then you had post-Second World War development planning. And so we could get away from this problem that we didn't extend universality to the realm of subsistence or beyond. I don't know if that answers your question. But I personally think there's many different discourses you could generate about basic income. I don't think one is more necessarily valuable than the other. And I think every context generates different discourses, and that's a good thing. That's necessary. Nevertheless, if you can put it in most general terms, where resources are not shared in a society, I think it's very unlikely that basic income is going to be viable in the long run, like legally and financially, and in terms of the freedom effect it's going to have. And that's just unavoidable. So however you decide to own resources in common, I think it's an interesting question. That can be different in different places. But where you don't own resources in common, I don't see how basic income is going to be sustainable and viable politically or financially.
Thank you. There is another question just behind the previous one. Please.
Hi, I'm Anna. Actually, just a comment. I think that also a very important discussion that we have to undertake is about which goods should be provided by the state, mm-hmm. and which goods should we get in the market. That is, and I think it's a very important discussion that has to occur parallel to a basic income, because a basic income can mean a totally different thing. Mm-hmm. If you have a state in which you have services like health, education, being provided by the state, or if you have a state where you have to buy these things with the basic income you get. So it's also very important that we define which goods should be a responsibility of the community that is produced by the state or state companies, and which goods should be exchanged for in the market. So I think it's also a very important discussion to be made.
Yeah.
You want to comment on that?
I don't think there was a question. I agree. I think that's more or less my argument. But if I may advertise, I've got a book coming out with Polity, in which I discuss all of these issues in more detail. And I talk about basic income as part of a human development public sphere. Okay, so.
Okay, the next question is over there, and then we come back to the center after that one. Please.
It's a combination of a question and a comment, Rainer Tuss. I think we always differentiate between the state and the market. For me, there are at least two other economic entities, that's the household and the commons. And the commons has been, I think, for too long neglected. And personally, I see the basic income as a sort of sharing of the sort of economic accumulation, historic accumulation, which is at the moment shared by sort of privileged 20 or 30,000 families on the globe. Mm. And I don't understand when you say, okay, we are expected to work, but we also accept willingly that a certain group of people don't need to work and already have a basic income, and that doesn't seem to pose a problem for our societies. So why should we not share it out for everybody? And that's why I like also the Euro dividend. Why should we not have a global economic dividend of what our ancestors accumulated in wealth and make it available to everybody? Thank you.
I don't think that was a question.
No,
but,
no.
yeah.
But you don't want if you don't want to comment on that, then there is, please, yes, raise your hand again. So, okay.
Yeah, thank you very much. Wolfgang from Germany. I agree to your conclusions from a theoretical point of view, but I have two questions. So the first one is, what if not all of the conditions you mentioned are not fulfilled? What do we do with the basic income? Don't implement, or only to a certain extent? And having in mind the discussion I often have in Germany, there might some people say then, oh yeah, well, we have to fulfill these conditions, this pillar you mentioned, and if we have that, we can then in 20 or 30 years start to begin the discussion about basic income. That might be a position from left people, unions and so on, who say that we have to work on this other conditions you mentioned. What do you say to this argument? I would say we need both parallel, but I would know what is your opinion, or what is your counter argument against this argumentation?
Well, no, I don't think there's a reason to wait. I mean, it's like saying we're not going to have an electoral democracy because we've got problems with economic distribution, right? So, no, of course we shouldn't wait. But I think that the conditions are right now that basic income is so visible in the public global debate for talking critically about what are good and bad conditions for sustaining basic income in terms both of its viability and its impacts. Simply
All
that.
right. Now we have.
It's not a one big bang. Now you get a basic income, it's all resolved. You know, it's like 10 years ago, I remember saying to myself, when everyone was saying, oh, how radical and utopian basic income was, I thought, well, it's not going to be long before the IMF and the World Bank introduces it. It's not going to be long. It's obvious. It's obvious you need a basic income to sustain a financialized world, right? And so you're also thinking ahead. You know, you need to think ahead. And I'm thinking ahead. I'm trying to make sure we think ahead. Well, I'm not saying that we shouldn't take the opportunities that arise.
Okay, we have two last interventions from the front row. First, please, lady over here. But people don't.
I'm just wondering, with your focus on resources in common, whether actually your conclusion would then be, you know, what we should ultimately right now be campaigning for is not so much basic income as just getting taxation back on the table, greater taxation, getting people to be all right with greater taxation. Because often in the conversation around basic income, you see things like, here's a way we can avoid increasing taxes too much, or here's a way around taxes, and I'm wondering if what you're proposing is actually a complete shift in that conversation towards, here's why we need to tax more. And
yes.
if you, yeah.
Yes. And I think, of course, then you get into all kinds of debates about what kind of taxation and so on. Again, I don't think we need to choose between all the new alternative taxes and the sort of taxing income, for example. I mean, I think a formalized market economy and formalized employment do generate opportunities for democratizing human activities that are very important. And therefore, I personally do not think the greatest thing on earth would be if we just found a lot of oil, had one big fund, and they distributed it all in basic income. Because I actually think that part of formalizing the economy is talking about how we protect human time, how we protect the pace of life, working life, and care in the economy. And these are important democratic decisions. I don't think they're just going to happen between individuals bargaining. I think that's going to leave a lot of people unprotected and a lot of issues never talked about, and I worry about that. But yes, in terms of, I prefer to say a larger public sphere, because I don't want to say what kind of taxation or what kind of ownership, but I do think it's just a reality that if too many resources are private or in the marketplace, you're not going to have common goals, you're not going to have a democratic discussion about shared goals. Yeah.
Okay, and then Pertti Koistinen.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. In my ears, I still hear your voice saying one sentence. You was asking, can the welfare state survive without basic income? For me, this is very interesting. And it leads to the question, so that if we take, for example, the income policies of the states, could we also put that in that way, so that do we need basic income also for the purposes of income policies, redistributive policies, but also in order to create consumption in the society?
Yeah. Well, I think basic income is essential for existence in cooperation in modern monetary societies. I suppose under this comes the ability to consume, but I suppose my kind of paradise wouldn't be of a mass universe of people with a low basic income consuming what a small elite decides we should consume. So I always get a bit worried about the consumption argument. For me, so if I'm not sure I understand your question correctly.
Yeah, but consumption could be regulated by means of...
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it, do you mean through individuals choosing better?
Yes, and for example, to what immaterial...
Yes. Yes, although I don't think basic income in itself is going to make everyone choose green goals. I mean, that'd be nice to think that, but I don't think that. I think you need a shared public sphere in terms of talking about what are good development goals. I don't think individuals will be able or have the incentives or the resources to do shared things that are going to be environmentally protective. I think you need other things.
I know you could be discussing this for another hour or two, but I have to remind you of something which Jürgen said earlier today. These conferences are also about having fun. So now it's about time to thank Louise for this contribution.